In writing, knowing your characters, setting, and plot is only half the battle. That's knowing what to write. Knowing how to write is just as important, because the most exciting story in the world isn't going to do you much good if readers are bored by your meandering narrator or become confused by your convoluted plot. Readers are going to be put off by those things and won't actually get to the fantastic story you've created. And believe me, editors and agents will pick up on this stuff much faster than the average reader. So it's worth the time to understand the core principles of writing. And one of the most important is story structure, particularly how to craft a proper scene. Scenes are one of the basic building blocks of writing, and mastering the structure and rules around them will help you to focus on what really matters. Writing a story that resonates and that's filled with characters and worlds that feel real. In this video, we're going to talk about what a scene is, and perhaps just as importantly, what it isn't. We'll talk about how to open a scene, how to build conflict, and how to end scenes with some sort of setback, a disaster for the protagonist. We'll talk about how to link scenes together and where it's appropriate to step back from the plot and delve into the mindset of characters. I'll also give you recommendations for further reading so you can expand on your knowledge of scene structure. As in my other Mastering Fiction videos, I'll be using the widely read and seen The Hunger Games as an example. Some of the advice will be tailored to fantasy and science fiction, but these concepts apply to all types of fiction, from romances to mysteries to thrillers and more. A quick word of advice. So far in my Mastering Fiction series, I've talked about brainstorming, world building, character creation, and plotting. This is part 5 of the series, and I'm recording them in such a way that they build on one another. The videos are self-contained, and you can watch any of them on their own, but I mention this because you may benefit from watching them in order to get a more well-rounded idea of how to create, write, and edit a novel. I have 3 more videos ready to go and a couple more in the works, so be sure to subscribe to be notified when those come out. Hi, I'm Brad Beaulieu, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author. I've published a dozen novels, more than 20 short stories, and I love talking about the craft of writing, which is why I started this channel, A Novel Approach. A Novel Approach is dedicated to helping you reach your writing goals by sharing inspiration, technique, and my 20+ years of experience in writing and publishing. We're going to get into the main content in just a sec, but before we do, I wanted to let you know that this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by those of you who get value out of these instructional videos and spread the word. Maybe buy me a coffee on ko-fi.com, link in the description below, and even buy signed books from my online store at quillings.com. Thanks so much for your continued support. It's because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. And for those of you who are new, please consider subscribing so you can keep up on all the latest tips, tricks, and deep dive techniques I'm adding on writing. Okay, so let's get started. I like to give the origin of each talk. I didn't come to writing early. I spent years in the IT and software programming worlds, and it was a struggle to understand how to turn the ideas I had into stories. I needed to understand the underlying structure of story. And that helped me in turn to write more effectively and freed me to focus on the things that mattered, like the characters, the world, and the plot. We're going to cover an introduction to the story question, and that will lead us into story structure and the purpose of scenes. Then we'll dive into the scenes themselves and their structure, including stimulus, internalization, and response. We'll talk about scene and sequel and one other story component called the transition. And finally, I'll give you a few pacing tips. For further reading, most of this discussion came from this book by Jack Bickham. This is Scene and Structure, and it's a really good nuts and bolts book that talks about what a scene is, what you're trying to accomplish, essentially all the things we're going to talk about in this presentation, but it goes into a lot more detail. And Jack took the idea for that book from a chapter of Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight Swain. This is also a very good book. It's more comprehensive. It really talks about the life of a writer and covers things like ideation, brainstorming, plotting, writing itself, editing, getting published. Now, this book was published in 1965, and so the market information is very dated, and you'll find that the examples that Swain gives are also quite dated. They're kind of a Mad Men style idea of what stories should and shouldn't be, and so keep that in mind, but beyond that, it's a really good book on writing in general, and I still highly recommend it. So let's talk about the story question. Every story has an arc, which is dictated by the story goal. So For example, Katniss in the Hunger Games must survive the arena that these kids go to after volunteering to take the place of her sister Prim. And just as a reminder, the Hunger Games is set in a mid to near future North America called Pan Am, in which there were 13 districts. There are now 12 after one was destroyed in a war. And every year, the capital demands tributes, one boy, one girl from the ages of 12 to 18 from each district to participate in the Hunger Games, in which the kids fight to the death and one victor survives. All others must die, and they are forced to fight one another if they choose not to for some reason. And so it's a very vicious set of games, and districts 1 and 2 are close to the capital, and the tributes that they send to the Hunger Games are called the careers. They make a career out of training for the Hunger Games, and they revere them, whereas the other districts don't. They fear them, and it's a tool of fear used to keep the populace under control. And so the choosing of the boy and the girl tribute from each district happens in a ceremony called the Reaping, in which all the boys and girls must attend, and one name is chosen from a bowl with the boys' names and one with the girls' names. And so Prim, Katniss' sister, is 12 years old. It's her first year of eligibility, and she's chosen. And Katniss knows Prim will die if she goes to the games, and so Katniss volunteers to take her place. And the reader converts that without thinking into a question. Will Katniss survive the games? Conflict prevents the character from attaining their goal. How is this conflict and story progression presented to the reader? Through a series of scenes. One definition of story structure we've used in these presentations before is a story is a person in a place, characters in a setting, with a problem that's presented in the inciting incident early on. The character goes through successive attempts to solve the problem, failing each time. That is the try-fail cycle that happens over and over again until ultimately succeeding or failing at the end in the climax. And then finally, a denouement closes the story. And so let's look at how this applies to the Hunger Games. Katniss Everdeen, a fierce young woman from District 12, must return home alive after taking the place of her sister in the Hunger Games. Katniss learns to navigate politics and the games themselves and narrowly escapes death. She survives with Peeta and returns home a changed woman. And so if we look at this structure, we have the inciting incident, a number of scenes with rising tension along the way that lead to the climax, and finally the denouement. The inciting incident, and you may have a prologue as well, those tend to be relatively short, and those might be like 5% of the novel roughly. The climax and the denouement might be another 5%. And so the stuff in the middle, that 90%, is made up of scenes, and that's what we're going to be talking about. And so if you can master the scene, you'll be much better prepared to write your novel. The opening and the inciting incident and also the climax and the denouement are special, and they have specific rules and goals that you're going to have for them. And I think I'm going to cover those in a separate video. So this can be kind of a complete look at the different components, the basic components of a story. But here we're going to talk about the scene, so you have a good grasp of what the most commonly used component of modern fiction looks like. Scenes have patterns. They have the statement of a goal, the introduction and development of conflict, and the failure of the character to reach their goal, a tactical disaster of some sort. Early on, Katniss needs to survive the opening of the games. The kids are brought to the arena, and they are separated and lifted through these elevators onto these platforms. So there's 24 platforms around the cornucopia, and the cornucopia has a lot of equipment, food, medicine, and weapons, things the kids could use to help keep themselves alive, but everyone's going to want them. And so a lot of the kids run towards the center, especially the careers, the kids from District 1 and 2. And it is a bloodbath. And so one of the techniques that the kids use is to simply run away and hide. They don't get anything from the cornucopia. And that is what Katniss is supposed to do. Haymitch, her mentor, advised her to do that, and she looks over at Peeta, the boy tribute from District 12, and he shakes his head as the games are about to begin, because he knows she wants to run for this bow and arrow that she sees, that she thinks is meant for her. So Peeta runs, and Katniss goes for that bow and arrow and ends up not getting that, but getting a backpack. She gets into a scuffle, a fight, and then she runs without the bow and arrow. That is that opening scene. And so she needs to survive the opening. She does so, but she loses Peeta and she doesn't get exactly what she wants. Note that when we say disaster, it's not story-ending disasters. They are setbacks of some type, and they could be emotional setbacks. The goal of the scene could be a romantic encounter or just getting to know somebody better, and it doesn't work out the way that they planned, and so that could be a type of disaster. So don't take it to mean it's a world-ending type of disaster. That's not what we're getting at here. It's just some kind of setback for the character. And so we have something that looks like this. Scene is a goal in the beginning, and we should have, at the very least, an implied goal. We should know what they're looking for, or better yet, an explicit goal. They should know somehow. Someone else tells them, or they tell themselves what they're looking for. And then there's the introduction and development of conflict, followed by the disaster at the end. So, an example, each scene will begin with the character working towards their goal, and it appears immediately attainable. That's the other important component of a goal. It shouldn't be super far-reaching. It should be immediate, and they should be able to get it at the end of that scene. Early on, Katniss needs to survive the opening of the games. The reader, just as they convert the story arc into a question, convert the scene goal into a question. Will Katniss survive the opening? So the reader does that without even thinking. Another example. If the scene goal is Katniss needs to attract attention from the sponsors, in the Hunger Games, there is as much going on outside of the games as there is inside. There are game masters who run the games, and it's a very science fictional type thing where they can create fires and make them sweep across the land, or they can create these huge dogs that chase the kids to certain areas to try to corral them and make them fight one another. And there are also sponsors. They can help kids inside of the games. They can give them medicine or weapons from the outside. And the implication is there's like money or influence involved in getting that to happen. But the sponsors first have to like these kids enough to do that, to spend that money or influence or what have you. And so part of the pre-games is training, but also sort of preening and parading themselves before the populace of the capital and the sponsors separately to try to gain these favors. And so at one point, Katniss is brought before these sponsors, and she's trying to get their attention to show she can survive and maybe get some help for her and Peeta. As we enter that scene, the goal is for her to get that attention so she can get those favors from the sponsors. Or if the scene goal is Katniss struggles with her growing love for Peeta. Katniss, we learn early on, has a romantic interest with a boy from District 12 named Gale. And so she establishes that connection. But then, as she's thrown into the games with Peeta, she begins to understand that Peeta has liked her for some time. And as she gets to know him, she starts to like him, maybe even love him. But how can she in the games? And so there are times where we wonder, will she give in to that? And so that could be the goal of a scene, to either explore her interest or to deny the temptation. And so the question becomes, will she or won't she? And then we have the conflict after we know the goal. Conflict is the heart of fiction. It must present itself as the character attempts to reach their goal. The cornucopia in that first example has things that can help, but it's extremely dangerous. The sponsors are bored when Katniss gets there. She is the 24th kid. She's the last one. And so when she goes before them, they've seen 23 other kids, and most of them are ignoring her, even though she displays great skill with her bow. And so she gets angry and she shoots an apple out of the mouth of a pig that's on a banquet table. Katniss resists her feelings for Peeta because of the situation that they're both in. In other circumstances, she might like to explore that interest with Peeta and see if it might grow into love, but she can't. They are going to be forced to fight other children and maybe each other by the end. So how can they possibly start to explore a love interest while they're going through this? Katniss feels like they can't. And then the disaster. The result of the conflict must be a disaster. Imagine if the characters reach their goals with no setbacks. So Katniss, for example, manages to escape the cornucopia, but she's alone and she lost track of Peeta along the way. So that's the disaster. Again, not earth-shattering, but it is a definite setback for her. The general rule is the character must be in worse shape at the end of the scene than when they went in. And that feels, to the reader, oddly enough, like progress. And there are types of disasters. There are 3. So there's no, the character does not reach their goal, and there's really no complications to it. There is no, and furthermore, the character doesn't achieve their goal and a new complication arises because of the conflict or the disaster. And yes, but the character might be allowed to reach their goal, but must do something first. So we'll talk about each of these. So the no disaster. The character attempts to reach their goal and is denied. In the Hunger Games, on the train, Katniss tries to convince Haymitch to help her and Peeta. Haymitch is their assigned mentor, and he is the winner of the Hunger Games, the only winner from District 12. And so he is assigned every year to help kids prepare themselves for the Hunger Games. But he was in it, and he was in the Quarter Quell, which is held once every 25 years. And so there's been 2 of them. I think this is like the 74th games, and so there's going to be one the next year. But Haymitch was in the previous Quarter Quell, and so 2 boys and 2 girls from every district, so 48 kids, go to the arena and fight one another to the death until only one victor survives. And Haymitch was the victor, and so he was involved in, or at least saw, the deaths of 47 other kids, and it messed him up. He is an alcoholic at this point, and he, since then, has been trotted out and forced to help the other kids from District 12, and no one else has won. So ever since then, he's seen and met 2 kids that died in the games, and so you can just imagine how badly that would mess with your head. And so he thinks that's going to happen again, just like the other 23 years since he won, and so he doesn't want to connect with them, and that's obvious, and his alcoholism contributes to that as well. And so Haymitch is a broken man, and he just denies her. He just does not want to engage with them. So at the very least, the character or characters have lost an option. Katniss believes she and Peeta are on their own. Now also note that Haymitch does eventually engage with them and help them. That comes later. But for this particular scene, this was a no disaster. And so also when we say disasters, it doesn't mean it's permanent. It may just mean the characters have to try a different way to get what they want. And then we have no and furthermore. So the character fails to reach their goal, and something bad happens to make matters even worse. So for example, can Katniss attract attention from the sponsors? The sponsors, as I mentioned, they're a little bored by this point by the time she arrives. She is the last. She's the 24th tribute that they've seen that day. And she puts on this impressive display of using her bow and arrow and other things, and most of them just ignore her. And she gets so angry, she shoots an arrow at their banquet table and skewers this apple that's in a pig's mouth on a banquet table. And Katniss, as written, she believes she's made a terrible mistake. She enters the elevator and leaves the sponsors thinking, man, I really screwed things up for not just me, but probably for Peeta too. Later on, that turns out to be a twist. She actually gains a lot of recognition, and they're all rated. All the kids are rated on a scale from 1 to 12. And she gets the highest score. She gets an 11 by doing that. And so it does turn out to be something that helps her and Peeta later on, but at the time, it felt like a no and furthermore. She felt like she screwed up badly. And then there's yes, but. The character is presented with a potential resolution, but must do something else first. These are often better than no disasters because they can pose ethical dilemmas or provide some twists. So can Katniss protect Prim from the Hunger Games? Yes, but Katniss herself must volunteer to take her place. Can Katniss blow up the career supplies? Later on in the games, after Peeta and Katniss have entered the arena, Katniss is on her own for a while, and then she finds Rue. Rue helps her to escape from the careers, and at that point, Peeta has allied himself with them, which confuses Katniss. She feels betrayed by that. More on that in a bit, but in the meantime, Katniss escapes the careers with Rue's help, and later on they team up together, and they decide to blow up the careers' supplies. The careers have sort of set up camp at the cornucopia, and they have this cache of supplies, and they set up mines around it to try to catch some of the other contestants who are still alive unawares and have them blow themselves up by going and taking those. And so Katniss manages to blow them up, but in the process, as she goes back to find Rue is caught in this net. The boy from District 1 is there. Katniss kills him, but he throws a spear and Rue dies. And so, yes, they manage to blow up the career supplies, but Rue dies in the process. And so let's talk about subplots. When I first read that in Bickham's book, I was like, there are successes along the way, aren't there? It's not a long series of disasters throughout a book. Yes, that is true. There are some successes, and those are almost always the result of subplots. And so we have our story structure with the inciting incident, the scenes, climax, end of story, and then we can have and will have various subplots. And those follow the same structure as a story. They'll have some introduction of a problem, and the character will go through a series of attempts to solve that problem and then succeed or fail in the end. So those are where some successes can occur. And note that these can kind of be interwoven with one another, perhaps, and will definitely be interwoven with the main plot. They shouldn't exist if they aren't involved somehow with the character trying to achieve the main story goal. So let's cover some examples. Example 1 is Peeta's betrayal. When they enter the games, they get separated. Katniss is hiding and she comes across the careers, or the careers come across her, is maybe a better description, and Peeta is with them. And she overhears them, and it sounds very much like Peeta is allied with them and they're keeping him alive so that he can help them find Katniss in particular. She got that high score. She was rated 11. She is a threat. And so they're trying to find her and kill her. And so Peeta being with them is this huge blow to Katniss. And so she hides from the careers and sees Peeta with them. Peeta seems to have allied himself with them against Katniss. With Rue's help, Katniss drops these tracker jackers on the careers. The arena is such that they can add things that are not part of our world. These tracker jackers are these genetically modified wasps, and they have a nest that happens to be right above the careers. And so Rue is hiding in the trees, and she points to it, and Katniss understands that she could cut it down, and these highly poisonous hornets could attack the careers below. And so that's what Katniss does. She cuts it down. She gets stung along the way, but the hornet's nest drops, and it kills, I think, at least one of the careers. I think the other ones are stung and hurt. And Katniss herself is stung several times, and the poison, not always fatal, is hallucinogenic. And so she gets down from the tree, she runs away, and she's like staggering. And Peeta finds her, and he shouts at her to run away. And so she's so out of her mind, she doesn't really get what's going on at the moment, but it's clear that Peeta isn't exactly out to kill her. And so this subplot continues after this point. It isn't actually resolved right there, but you can see how that's playing out along with the main storyline of Katniss just trying to stay alive and get out of the games and get back to her family. Second example, Haymitch's help. I mentioned that he was unwilling to help on the train. So Katniss and Peeta are introduced to Haymitch on the train going to the capital, and they learn that he's a drunk and he doesn't want to help. Katniss tries to get him to help her and Peeta, but he's not invested and essentially rebukes her through inaction. But later, Haymitch sees something in Katniss and Peeta. Katniss is very skilled with the bow. She's a good hunter. She's a survivor. She knows how to stay alive in the woods. Peeta, meanwhile, is a political animal, it turns out. And the games themselves are half survival and half politics. They are a construct of the administration, and there are game masters who control things, and they want things to go a certain way. And then there are sponsors as well, and they can help kids inside of the arena. And Haymitch knows all this stuff, and so he does things and helps Katniss and Peeta inside of the arena after the games have started. And so he does invest himself. He does want them to live. He sees something in them that makes him think they might be able to survive. And so he finally starts helping them in earnest. And that's kind of the close of that subplot. And then a third example, Katniss and Peeta's romance. And so Peeta reveals he burned some bread, and he was supposed to give it to some pigs in the backyard, and he throws it to Katniss because he likes her, but he knows her family is starving. Katniss's father died in a mining accident, so you're not explicitly told, but you get the impression that they had a very rough life after their father died in that accident. So after they enter the pre-games, that ride to the train in the pre-games, and then into the arena itself, Katniss starts to realize she likes Peeta, but she suppresses those feelings, because how can they explore any of that stuff? And there's also Gale back home. So her growing interest in Peeta is complicated by her like/love of Gale, her desire to be with him and maybe make a life together. She feels deeply betrayed when they enter the arena, and she sees Peeta with the careers working against her, she thinks. And then the revelation that Peeta did that to protect her deepens her feelings for him. Later on, they find one another, and being together and Peeta nearly dying at one point deepens her care and love for him. So you can see how this isn't the main story per se, but it's definitely related and it has its own arc. So that's the third example of a subplot. So why use them? Well, imagine if problems were introduced and resolved immediately. Things coming too easily to the protagonist make the story boring and lackluster. And so a rule: never introduce a problem and solve it in the same chapter. Instead, delay the resolution. You may not create a subplot for every problem that you introduce, but do delay it so there's time for the tension to grow around the resolution of that problem, and maybe do that through a subplot. Just depends on the nature of it. And so let's dive into the scene itself. We're going to talk about structure and microcosm, cause and effect. Life can have a randomness to it. It's accepted because we have proof that events happen. We see the news, we see it online and social media. Stuff just happens and we accept it because we're used to that sort of thing. But stories are different. Fiction has to have a predictability. Effects must derive from causes. Causes must drive effects. And scene and chapter plotting deals with that, cause and effect. So let's talk about stimulus and response. This is cause and effect at a minute level. So a stimulus is some external action. Some action someone can see, either facial expression, words, action of fighting sequence where they're swinging a sword at somebody else. A response is an external reply to that action. And so an example, I'm going to take some passages from the book itself. And this first one comes from, I think this is before the reaping occurs back in District 12, before Prim is chosen. And Gale and Katniss are outside of the boundaries of District 12, which is a punishable offense. And they're talking. We could do it, Gale says quietly. What? I ask. Leave the district. Run off. Live in the woods. You and I, we could make it, says Gale. And so the words that Gale is saying is a stimulus. And the response from Katniss is to say, what? And then he expands on that, leave the district, run off, live in the woods. And so that's his response to the stimulus he received from her. So this is a back and forth between these two characters. Another example. This is later on. This is after Rue has shown Katniss the Tracker Jacker nest and Katniss dropped it. And Rue is clearly following Katniss. And so this starts here. They're not the only ones who can form alliances, I say. For a moment, no response. Then one of Rue's eyes edges around the trunk. You want me for an ally? Why not? You saved me with those Tracker Jackers. You're smart enough to still be alive, and I can't seem to shake you anyway, I say. She blinks at me, trying to decide. You hungry? I can see her swallow hard, her eye flickering to the meat. Come on then, I've had 2 kills today. And so it's verbal on Katniss's part, but note down below, she blinks at me, trying to decide. That is Katniss's interpretation of what Rue is doing, and it's very likely accurate. But that is Rue's response. Her silence is a response, and that becomes a stimulus for Katniss to say, you hungry? And then we see another nonverbal response. I can see her swallow hard, her eye flickering to the meat. And then Katniss replies, come on then, I've had 2 kills today. And so not all of this is super obvious. It could just be a passage of time that causes someone to say something else, something further, to try to convince them to do whatever. And so we have something like this that's going on inside of a scene. We have 2 characters interacting, and action on the part of one becomes the stimulus on the part of the other character, and that creates a response in them. That is a stimulus for the other character, and it goes back and forth like this. Now, this is a very simplified version of how this works, and can work if it's a kind of a rapid-fire exchange. And so the scene might look something like this. We have the statement of the goal that we already covered, the introduction and development of conflict, and a disaster. And we have inside of that conflict this stimulus response going back between at least 2 characters, maybe more. Now, that's a pretty simplified look at how the conflict might go. Some responses, due to their complexity, need an explanation for the reader, and the internalization is used for this. The sequence is usually stimulus, internalization, and then response. Continuing from where we left off before, we could do it, Gale says quietly. What? I ask. Leave the district, run off, live in the woods. You and I, we could make it, says Gale. I don't know how to respond. The idea is so preposterous. If we didn't have so many kids, he adds quickly. They're not our kids, of course, but they might as well be. Gale's 2 little brothers and a sister, Prim. So that little bit, I don't know how to respond. The idea is so preposterous. That is an internalization for Katniss. We are understanding a bit more about her, how she works, how she thinks, how she's thinking about this situation at this particular time. Just like Rue earlier, there is a gap in time where she's not saying anything. She doesn't know how to respond. And so Gale picks up. He says, if we didn't have so many kids, he adds quickly. Right? And so her internalization, we don't have to say that there was a pause of any kind. We get that from what he says. And then she says they're not our kids, of course, but they might as well be. His 2 little brothers and Prim. And so also note, this internalization is starting to reveal a lot about Katniss, and Gale, in fact, without Collins, the author, really saying so. We get the idea that these 2 young adults Katniss and Gale are right on the cusp of making a life together. They're talking about going away together with their sisters and brothers who are like kids for them. They're taking care of them, right? They're providing for them. And Katniss is providing for her mother as well. And it's sort of implied that she might have to come too. Without Collins saying so explicitly, we get that these two are interested in one another, that they like one another, maybe even love one another, and that they're perhaps ready to take the next step. And this is also a necessary step before Peeta is introduced. We need to know about Gale before the love interest angle of Peeta is introduced after they meet and they're on the train together and they're thrown into this horrible circumstance with one another. So internalizations are a way to reveal character and a lot more. This tells you a lot about their lives together, their interests, and so it's our primary way to reveal what the characters are like without saying so in an explicit manner. Another example, continuing from the other one. I can see her swallow hard, her eyes flickering to the meat. Come on then, I've had 2 kills today. Rue tentatively steps out into the open. I can fix your stings. Can you? I ask. How? She digs in the pack she carries and pulls out a handful of leaves. I'm almost certain they're the ones my mother uses. Where'd you find those? And so here too, we have the internalization from Katniss. I'm almost certain they're the ones my mother uses. That is a connection from Rue through Katniss to Katniss's mother. So we understand now that Katniss's mother was an herbalist at the very least. She was likely their family doctor, maybe a doctor to other people. She was wise in those ways, in other words. And Rue is too. And so that deepens the connection between these two characters and also expands on Katniss's life, just by that one little internalization. Internalizations are a very economical way, an effective way, to reveal more about the character, their past, their hopes, their desires, and so on. So instead of that simplified back and forth, we have something like this. We have an action on the part of one character that becomes a stimulus on the part of another character that leads to some internalization and then a response, and that becomes a stimulus for the other character. And so we have that kind of back and forth. It's more realistic, more economical, gives a better view of the protagonist. Note that the internalizations will never occur for anyone but the POV character. And you may switch POV characters in different scenes, that's fine, but whoever your POV character is, unless you're writing omniscient point of view, which isn't used very much these days, you're going to be sticking to the main character, the POV character for a scene, and so the internalizations will only appear for them. Now, I mentioned that Katniss read Rue and sort of interpreted her hesitation. That's okay, because it's coming from the POV character. They are interpreting that. It's not the narrator interpreting for the other character. But generally speaking, internalizations are going to be for POV characters only. And so now we have something like this. We have the goal, we have the conflict, and we have internalizations kind of mixed in with that stimulus response. And finally, we end with the disaster. Now, beware stimulus and response out of order. Is this correct? Joe spun after hearing a gunshot. Well, no, because the stimulus follows the response. It should be written as Joe heard a gunshot and spun. But you can use that to momentarily confuse the reader intentionally. It's kind of useful in high action scenes where you want to confuse the reader a little bit, but just be aware of it. You don't want to overuse that. You can also vary the order of internalization and response to express emotional state. Stimulus, internalization, and then response is the norm, and it gives the impression of a character with time to think. Stimulus, response, and then internalization gives the impression of surprise or high emotion. For example, from that previous passage where Rue and Katniss were talking about leaves to help her stings, we come to this passage. Rue presses a gloppy green wad of chewed leaves and spit on my knee. Oh, the sound comes out of my mouth before I can stop it. It's as if the leaves are actually leaching the pain right out of the sting. Rue gives a giggle. Lucky you had the sense to pull the stingers, or you'd be a lot worse. Do my neck. Do my cheek, I almost beg. And so we see the oh, that is the response, and then the internalization. And so it's a surprise reaction from Katniss. And then we almost feel the pain leaking from her along with that description because of that surprise. We're kind of caught in the moment. So that's a very effective way to connote that. Crafting scenes with results. Good, effective scenes will have results, and in devising the scenes, it's important to consider the goals, the angles in the conflict in that middle section, and the nature of the disaster at the end. And we should consider the scope the immediacy, the finality, and the direction of these things. When we're selecting our goal and our disaster at the end, if our scope is too small, the scene is effectively useless. It's not doing enough. It's not pulling its weight. It's more of a distraction than anything. And if it's too big, the story can be derailed, either at that point or soon after. So you just want to be wary and careful of how big you're making it and where it fits in the story. Maybe that should come later or something. The immediacy, how quickly is this happening? If it's too immediate, the story can seem to trip over itself in an attempt to reach the climax. Now, I say this, but if you have this like one time, it's probably fine. But if you do this too often in sequence, the reader will pick up on that and they'll start to feel like things are just kind of helter-skelter and there's no breathing room for the characters. On the other hand, if it's not immediate enough, the tension lags and the reader interest drops. The finality, if it's too final, it doesn't leave enough options for the characters afterwards. I give the example of like the characters are sent to a prison of some sort. They physically can't do much while they're there. Now, again, I say this, and that might provide a very interesting way to show that these characters are resourceful by finding a way for them out of that jam. But you can have a situation where you just don't give the characters enough ways out. It's too final. Or if it's not final enough, if a guard comes and releases them without really much action on their own, that can feel not very final. And so what was that previous scene for, where they were sent to the prison? And then the direction. This is kind of indicating where things go after the disaster, because the disasters themselves can limit where the story can go. And so if you have too much change, the story can feel like it's reeling from one place to another. And if there's not enough, it can feel predictable, which you don't want either. You also want angles in that conflict section in the middle. It should have an ebb and flow. The character and the antagonist should try different tacks at different times during the scene. Keep in mind that the character wants something, and the antagonist, it doesn't have to be the antagonist of the main story, just the antagonist of that scene. They're trying to deny the character something, because that's how you've devised the scene. And they don't want to give that character whatever it is they're searching for whatever reason. And so human nature is to try different tacks, both on the part of the main character who wants something and the antagonist who doesn't want to give it to them, right? So try different tacks at different times. Their efforts should also escalate, especially the main character. They are becoming more desperate, and maybe the antagonist is too. Things should escalate as the conflict moves on. And then the nature of the disaster often imply or limit the direction the plot can logically go afterwards, and choosing the disaster rashly can lead to the story going in a direction you didn't really intend. Often when stories become unmanageable, it's because some improper disaster was chosen somewhere along the way. A piece of advice I commonly give is if you feel like you're lost, like you don't know where the story's going, it doesn't feel right to you, you should take some time and just work your way backwards through the story. And when it feels good again, when it feels right in that scene, you've probably done something wrong. You've picked a disaster that isn't the right choice, and it sent you on a direction you don't want to go. So you can change the nature of the disaster, go a different direction, and get back on track on your story. Planning and revising scenes for maximum effect. Disasters work, oddly enough. They move the story forward by seeming to move the central characters further back from their goals, leaving them in worse trouble than they were in before the scene started. Readers will put up with a lot if your scenes just keep making things worse for the characters. Also, you can seldom write a scene in isolation of other plans for your story, because the disasters are going to dictate a lot about what can happen later. So as you're plotting and thinking about a particular scene, you really do have to look at it in context with everything else. In searching for that disaster, don't always grab the first idea that comes to mind. This is a very common thread throughout my different presentations. Keep pushing until you find something that gives you juice and that works for the story, that feels true and right for the story. Also, don't be afraid to have the antagonist try to get the lead character off the point of the argument as one of his opposing tactics. That's just human nature as well. People will try anything to get out of a situation they don't want to be in, right? And so think of different ways to have them oppose the main character. So use that as one of the ways to deny the main character what they're hoping to get. And also remember that people aren't always rational in high-stress situations. One of the failings I had early on, and I still fall into this trap now and again, I feel like I'm a pretty reasonable person, and most people are. And I write a lot of my characters that way. Like, they are kind of reasonable and logical, but we aren't logical when we are in high emotive states, right? When we're really angry or desperate or in love or what have you. And so you won't act rationally. And so I'm not saying always make your characters irrational, but there are certainly times and places for that. And that just makes them come across as human. So keep that in your back pocket as well. Also be alert for ways to raise the stakes. Higher stakes can make a story feel like the pacing is faster because it's so important, right, to the character or people beyond them. Never let your characters relax or feel comfortable. So let's talk about the sequel. In fiction, there must be other components than just the scene. There are essentially two, the transition and the sequel. The transition is fairly straightforward. It serves as the bridge to transport the reader from one scene to another. It describes what happened since the last scene and sets the new scene, which orients the reader in time and space. It links those two scenes narratively. It provides necessary information to set up the new scene, and it usually implies or explicitly states the goal of the following scene. And so once we have that in mind, we now have our goal, the new scene is off and running. So an example, this is early on, this is right after Katniss has volunteered to take Prim's place, and Peeta has been chosen as the boy tribute. The moment the anthem ends, we are taken into custody. I don't mean we're handcuffed or anything, but a group of peacekeepers marches us through the front door of the Justice Building, and there's a bit more description of the room Katniss is taken to. When I sit on the couch, I can't help running my fingers over the fabric repeatedly. It helps to calm me as I try to prepare for the next hour, the time allotted for the tributes to say goodbye to their loved ones. I cannot afford to get upset, to leave this room with puffy eyes and a red nose. Crying is not an option. There will be more cameras at the train station. And so here we're coming from this highly emotional scene where Katniss takes Prim's place, and we're going to a scene where she is being given time to say goodbye to her mother and sister, and she is in a family where she is kind of the mother figure. And so the scene that's about to take place is not just goodbye. It's Katniss preparing Prim to take on more responsibility and be ready in case her mother doesn't step up to the plate, and also speaking to her mother very directly and telling her she can't check out again like she did when Papa died, right? She has to engage and take care of Prim. And so that's what the next scene is going to be about, and that's what this leads to. That's where it stops. And so Prim and Katniss's mother come in and they have that exchange. And of course, it is complicated by the fact that they only get so much time, and it says so right here. The time allotted for the tributes to say goodbye to their loved ones. That's 1 hour. And so that's a very good setup for the next scene. So you can see how those transitions can work and can tie two scenes together. And then there's the sequel. If you want to delve in any depth into the mental state of the POV character, to analyze their state of mind after the most recent disaster, another sort of component is used. And that's the purpose of the sequel. And so the sequel follows a pattern. It has emotion, thought, planning, and action. And what this is trying to do is to model the way humans work. So let's talk about these in detail. So the first one, emotion. The character deals with the disaster mentally. They experience emotion. That's what we do. We're not thinking logically at that point. So we deal with that loss on an emotional level. And then we have thought. After the emotions have run their course, the character thinks about what happened and what it means for their goals. Then we have planning. The character reviews their options. They still have an overarching story goal, and so they have to look at their options now that this disaster has taken place and choose one, which leads to action. The character embarks on their next attempt to resolve the story goal. And so for the Hunger Games, I'm going to use the death of Rue, which is a hugely impactful event for Katniss. Now, keep in mind that what happened was she left her family, she took Prim's place, and she, Katniss, is a provider. She is very protective. She loves her family deeply, and she doesn't really have anyone to care for like that in the games, in the arena. Prim is gone physically from her. She's physically removed back in District 12. And so Rue is a stand-in for Prim inside of the arena. And so Katniss bonds with Rue, and Rue bonds with her. And so when she dies, partly because of the plan of action that they developed together, so it's partly Katniss's fault that she died, she lays with Rue, she holds her hand, and she sings a song from her district. And so that's where this picks up. And so again, we're dealing with emotion at this point. Rue has just died. Everything's still and quiet. Then, almost eerily, the mockingjays take up my song. For a moment, I sit there, watching my tears drip down on her face. Rue's cannon fires. And so after each death in the arena, a cannon fires to signify that one of the children, one of the tributes, has died. And then there's more description of Rue and how she'll be taken away from the arena now that she is dead. Gale's voice is in my head. His ravings against the capital no longer pointless, no longer to be ignored. Rue's death has forced me to confront my own fury against their cruelty, the injustice they inflict upon us. But here, even more strongly than at home, I feel my impotence. There's no way to take revenge on the capital, is there? And so this story, not just The Hunger Games, the first book, but the whole trilogy, is about an uprising, a rebellion against the status quo, which is very cruel to the populace. And I would argue that it truly begins, she becomes invested in seeing this powerful administration and President Snow, who runs it, fall. And so this is Katniss dealing with, emotionally, the death of Rue. And then we have thought. I want to do something, right here, right now, to shame them, to make them accountable, to show the capital that whatever they do, or force us to do, there is a part of every tribute they can't own, that Rue was more than a piece in their games, and so am I. She gathers flowers and lays them over Rue's body, knowing that that's going to be picked up by the video feeds and shown to everybody in Panem. Bye, Rue, I whisper. I press the 3 middle fingers of my left hand against my lips and hold them out in her direction. Then I walk away without looking back. And then we have planning. I've no idea where to go. The brief sense of home I had that one night with Rue has vanished. My feet wander this way and that until sunset. I'm not afraid, not even watchful, which makes me an easy target. Except I'd kill anyone I met on sight. And she ruminates a little bit on Peeta and Rue. I really think I stand a chance of doing it now. Winning. It's not just having the arrows or outsmarting the careers a few times, although those things help. Something happened when I was holding Rue's hand, watching her life drain away. Now I am determined to avenge her, to make her loss unforgettable, and I can only do that by winning and thereby making myself unforgettable. And then finally we have action. Claudius Templesmith is one of the commentators on the games, and his voice booms down from overhead, and he announces a rule change to the games. Under the new rule, both tributes from the same district will be declared winners if they have the last 2 alive. Claudius pauses, as if he knows we're not getting it, and repeats the change again. The news sinks in. 2 tributes can win this year, if they're from the same district. Both can live. Both of us can live. Before I can stop myself, I call out Peeta's name. So we can see her choice of action, and note that other parts of the story are sort of invading Katniss' space here. This actually comes from on high, from President Snow himself. He has allowed this rule change to take place. And so don't get the impression that as you're working through the sequel, that you can't also pull on other threads and sort of weave them into that. You can. And that's what Collins did here, and it helps to give Katniss drive to go and find Peeta. And so the very next scene is going to be her trying to find him. And so it leads directly into that next scene. That is the purpose of the sequel. And so we have a pattern that turns out something like this in theory. We have scene followed by sequel, next scene, another sequel. But sequels aren't always needed, and so a more realistic pattern emerges. We'll have sequels at major turning points, big setbacks for the characters, emotional points in the story. So we'll only use them where appropriate. And we can use them to control pace. Stories, or even just parts of your stories, can suffer from one of 2 ailments. Either the story is tripping over itself with speed, possibly because it isn't as deeply immersed in the hero as it could be, or the story plods along at an elephant's pace, possibly because it's too deeply embedded in character. And so if we want to slow the story down, consider giving your viewpoint character more internalizations. Also look for ways to build in more breathing time for your viewpoint character between scenes. Study your existing sequels and consider expanding one or more parts of them. And this can help to connect the reader more to that character and slow things down both, and that will help a lot with reader engagement because they care what happens to those characters once they connect with them, once they sympathize with them. If we want to speed the story up, look for scenes where the amount of time for the conflict can be reduced, or look for scenes where the conflict can be entered in the middle of things. You might have a boxing match, and instead of describing them getting to the arena and getting taped up and doing warm-ups and going out to the ring, you could start with the first punch. So could that work for some of your scenes where you're trying to speed things up? Maybe you do have too many sequels and you need to just remove them and butt two scenes up against one another. Also look for places where the sequel maybe can't be removed entirely, but just could be simplified. And look for ways to raise the stakes in existing scenes. Sometimes that intensity helps to make things feel like it's moving faster. Also note what we haven't talked about, the info dump. The info dump is a common pitfall among newer writers who add blocks of information they think the reader needs. But info dumps don't have a place in modern fiction. Instead, incorporate necessary information in dialogue between characters as they're having their back and forth, and internalizations. Now, I say this knowing that some authors will have huge info dumps. And I haven't read his books, but I've heard from other people that Neal Stephenson goes into a lot of detail on some elements, and I think he does it really well. And so you can look at them for examples of what might work. But the key to that type of thing is to make the reader want that information first. And I think the best writers who do go into that kind of depth, and I think like a military sci-fi is kind of famous for digging into some of the details of weaponry and technology and that sort of thing. It is okay from time to time, but you want to pick and choose your battles very carefully. The best way, normally in my mind, is to add that stuff to the dialogue and to sort of sneak that stuff in, and also make the reader want to know about it before you give it to them. So share the bare minimum needed at any given point in a story, and it will slowly come out. The readers will wait. What they care about initially is not that stuff. They care about connecting with the characters, figuring out what they're about, what they're trying to do, what their hopes and fears are, that sort of thing. So focus on that. As I was reading Bickham's book, I thought a lot about where the best places to end chapters is. And scenes don't always map exactly to chapters. You could have a scene that spans 2 chapters. That's perfectly viable, and we'll see some examples here. But one good place to end a chapter is at the point of disaster, and that's the most common by far. You write a scene, that is a chapter, it ends with the disaster, and then that becomes kind of a hook for the reader to read on because they saw something bad happen and they want to see what happens next. Another place you can consider is in the middle of conflict. So maybe in that boxing match, the main protagonist knows they're about to lose and they're not really sure what to do about it, and this haymaker punch comes at him, end chapter. Who's stopping there? Right? Nobody. No one's going to stop. They're going to go to the next page, the beginning of the next chapter, and read on. Another possibility is the character is in the planning process in the sequel. So remember, we had the emotion, thought, planning, and they're trying to think what to do next, and they can't think of anything. There's no hope. They don't know what to do. End chapter. And then the last one, at the point of decision. In Katniss's example, she goes through the death of Rue, and then she realizes from the game masters that she and Peeta can both survive, and so she's after Peeta. So she's full of decision. End chapter. And the reader will absolutely move on to the next chapter to see what's going to happen next. So wrapping up, most modern fiction is written in the scene and sequel structure, and this structure is not limiting, it is liberating. It frees you to worry about the good stuff, the conflicts the characters will face along the way to the climax of the story. Understanding basic story structure, the scene in particular, is so useful. It prevents clumsy or worse, dull writing. It keeps you focused on the things that are going to keep the reader glued to the page. It allows you to focus less on the architecture and more on the presentation. Who are the characters? What are they trying to do? Who is opposing them, and what happens if they fail? Constructing scenes properly will help you create a story that grabs the reader and carries them along all the way through to the end. If this is new to you, and it certainly was to me, it will take time to internalize these concepts, but stick with it. The effort is worth it. Once these concepts become ingrained, you'll create scenes that work without effort, and the writing process itself will become easier, and the story will be better for you having put in that effort. Now I'd like to turn it over to you. Have you come across books or other resources that explain story structure that you found particularly useful? Have you found any alternate explanations of scene structure that work for you? Does delving into structure make the writing feel stilted or awkward? And if you've been at this a while, did it get better for you over time? If you found this useful, I hope you'll like and share with those who might gain benefit from it. As I mentioned, I have 3 more mastering fiction videos ready to go, a couple more in the works, some Scrivener how-tos as well. So hit subscribe to be notified when those come out. Until next time, everyone, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.